Hi, gang. Hi. Our speakers for 700 years, and we are delighted that the last few have been in our presence here. Jody, Welker, come on up.
Thank you. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about Howard Thurman. Let me first say a couple of things. I'm no expert. I'm just sharing a passion. And some of you may know more than I do, and I would invite the conversation to continue this. My goal today is to wet your whistle a little bit, to learn more about Howard Thurman and his life, and maybe encourage you for further exploration. I feel like I'm channeling my inner Dick Ray, because Dick, when I asked him, why did you study all these obscure people you talked about? He said, well, I kept wanting to hear what the Reformers, what Calvin studied, and he kept going deeper. Well, I became interested years ago in what influenced Martin Luther King Jr. And part of that was every MLK Day, it would come around and there was hardly a mention in culture that he was a Christian or a minister. It was just, it's been secularized. And I thought, I wonder what the story is behind the story. And then it doesn't take long to go a little bit deep and find Howard Thurman is the story underneath the story. So again, kind of like Dick Ray said, all right, let me learn about Howard Thurman. And then along the way, I found a gift, and it wasn't just a study of Howard Thurman. It was really a devotional life. And I was led into the devotional work of Howard Thurman, and I'll show you a couple of the book titles in a minute, and the meditations, and those have fed me, so I was fed by that. And then there was another connection I discovered. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. He grew up in Daytona Beach, Florida. And he went to high school in Jacksonville. So all of a sudden, this Floridian is wondering, how did this African American from Florida become such a prominent figure? So I wanted to follow the story of his life. So my goal today is just to introduce you to Howard Thurman. I want to introduce you to, first we'll look at a few of the quotes that a couple are really famous and others not so much, but they'll get you a sense of the person. And then there's a great PBS video that does a wonderful program on Howard Thurman, but the introduction, I'll share that with you. And then I want to share you the stories, the influences on his life. And I really scanned for this crowd some Presbyterian influences, so we'll see how he connected with the Presbyterian Church. So I'll be reading some of the stories later, but I wanted to start out with, I love this picture of Howard Thurman. You see a lot of serious pictures, but he was a teacher. And he loved it. And if you listen, there's a podcast with his recordings, and you just hear his voice, the kindness, a joy of this person. And this is just talking about how he grew up in Florida and Georgia, and that had left scars for him. And if you look at the bottom, the quote says, "Nevertheless, a strange necessity has been laid upon me to devote my life to the central concern that transcends the walls that divide and would achieve in literal fact what is experienced as literal truth. Human life is one, and all people are members one of another. And this insight is spiritual, and it is the hard core of the religious experience." So if you wanted to put the bottom line under everything, I think that would be the summary of what you would want to talk about. Oops. So why should we be interested in Thurman at all? Well, as I mentioned, his influence on Martin Luther King Jr. and all the civil rights movement. You'll hear more about that in a moment. He's a person of great spiritual depth and grounding, and that's what really attracts me to him. The devotional prayer offerings, and I think it doesn't take a big leap to translate the lessons that he taught during the civil rights movement, to translate those for the issues of our day. They're just as current because, the moral, spiritual foundation doesn't change. Those circumstances may change. So we have a lot to learn, and I'm still doing that work of translation. There's lots of writings. The ones that I would just highlight for you, the first two are called Meditations of the Heart and Deep is the Hunger. And those are a series of very short meditations that he actually used in bulletins in some of his worship service. In some of his worship services, he developed this time of silent meditation before the service. And he would have these quotes that were part of the silent meditation so you could reflect on the quote. And basically the books are lots of those quotes, and they're wide and varied. The most famous book we'll look at later is Jesus and the Disinherited. That's really the core work that people point to, and we'll look at that again in a minute. So I wanted to share just a few quotes that I think, just to give you a sense of it, and they'll be a little bit varied. The first one I think is very representative of who he is. How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see oneself pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashing, with noisy silences. while something deep within hungers and thirsts for the still moment and the resting lull. We look at ourselves in this waiting moment, the kinds of people we are. The questions persist. What are we doing with our lives? What are the motives that order our days? What is the end of our doings? Where are we trying to go? Over and over the questions beat upon the waiting moment. As we listen, floating up through all the jangling echoes of turbulence, there is a sound of another kind, a deeper note which only the stillness of the heart makes clear. It moves directly to the core of our being. Our questions are answered, our spirits refreshed, and we move back into the traffic of our daily round with the peace of the eternal in our step. How good it is to center down. And then some of the quotes, the one on the right, let me point out, the one that's the most famous quote is the one you hear out from preachers almost after every Christmas. It's the famous one, when the song of the angels is stilled, when the star of the sky is gone, when the kings and the princes are home, when the shepherds are back to their flocks, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, and to bring peace among people, to make music in the heart. Y'all familiar with that quote? Probably the most commonly used Howard Thurman quote. Another very famous one that you often will see in quotes is this one. Don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. Kind of reminds me a little bit of the Buechner quote a little bit, but focusing on that, what makes you come alive. My hunch is if we talked about what made us come alive in this room, it'd be varied and different, and he would embrace all those differences. Another one, I promise we're not going to have the whole presentation on this, but there's something in every one of you that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. It's the only true guide you will ever have. And if you cannot hear it, you will all of your life spend your days on the ends of strings that someone else pulls. Wow. And then prayer, because he was a person of deep prayer, he said prayer is a form of communication between God and man and God. I'm always impressed by the fact it's recorded that the only thing that the disciples asked Jesus to teach them was how to pray. And I share that partly because I do think prayer is something that is taken for granted. We just kind of do it rotely. But underneath all his work is this life of prayer. And I fear sometimes in our current age, even in the church, we forget that that's a spiritual underground of foundation of what we do. And then you're going to hear he's a contemplative. In the stillness of the quiet, if we listen, we can hear the whisper of the heart giving strength to the weakness, courage to fear, hope to despair. Whatever the tensions and stresses of a particular day, there is always lurking close at hand the trailing beauty of forgotten joy or unremembered peace. And then on hatred, Jesus rejected hatred because he saw that hatred meant death to the mind, death to the spirit, death to communion with his Father. He affirmed life, and hatred was the great denial. And then another one on hatred. During times of war, hatred becomes quite respectable, even though it has to masquerade often under the guise of patriotism. And then, I'm not going to read the whole humor quote because I like laughing. If you know me, I love humor. So I love Reinhold Niebuhr too, and I love his work on humor, but I just wanted to see what he had to say about humor. He says, humor may not be laughter, it may not be a smile, it may be primarily a point of view, an attitude toward experience, a tangent. And let me skip to the bottom two. All the gods of depression, gloom, and melancholy must shriek with alarm when there rings down the corridor the merry music of the humorous spirit. What a deadly religion if it has no humor. What a dreary life where that precious venture has not emerged. And I like that partly because as one who now is retired and travels among churches, sometimes you enter a church where there's laughter and humor, and you probably have been in churches that have been just deadly. And I think to myself, why would anybody want to join this church? Where there's humor and laughter and joy, that seems to be contagious to me. That's a Welker bias, by the way. And I thought I'd share a prayer, one of his prayers. He just has many beautiful prayers. Lord, Lord, open unto me light for my darkness. Open unto me courage for my fear. Open unto me hope for my despair. Open unto me peace for my turmoil. Open unto me joy for my sorrow. Open unto me strength for my weakness. Open unto me wisdom for my confusion. Open unto me forgiveness for my sins. Open unto me tenderness for my toughness. Open unto me love for my hates. Open unto me thyself for myself. Lord, Lord, open unto me. It's a beautiful prayer. So I want to just share with you an introduction to him. You can find the full documentary, but it's a great introduction of Howard Thurman, and you're going to hear the voices of people who were influenced by him in this journey, and I think it's a good introduction. See how we do. How's it sound on that?
The grandson of slaves, yet Howard Thurman would become one of the most celebrated religious figures of the 20th century.
I'll need it up, or
A mentor to Martin Luther King Jr.
We wanted that way about the all time.
And a moral anchor for the civil rights movement.
Martin Luther King Jr. would quote Howard Thurman on many, many occasions.
I think Howard Thurman, for many leaders in that movement, King included, played the role of pastor.
In the 1930s, after a historic meeting with Mahatma Gandhi, Thurman becomes one of the early voices for nonviolent resistance for people who over centuries experienced unimaginable violence.
He helped to establish the philosophical framework of how to struggle.
He saw himself as a spiritual activist because he was fundamentally a teacher.
He had this combination of being kind and being strong, and I think that's a very rare combination.
While Sunday morning was often considered the most segregated hour in the week, Thurman helped pioneer a church where people of different races and religions could worship together.
He's suspicious of denomination and dogma and creed. He would never identify himself as a theologian because he thought theologians boxed God.
And he was called a mystic because he believed religious experience was best explored within.
Howard Thurman was actually practicing contemplative spirituality before we actually started calling it contemplative spirituality.
At his heart, he was a nature mystic. Thurman is talking to trees. Trees!
Yet this mystic was also an outspoken critic of Christianity for its part in the nation's deep racial divides, and he countered with a shocking new work that offered a revolutionary new way of understanding the life of Jesus Christ and how it speaks directly to the oppressed and disinherited.
I carry the with me Jesus and the disinherited every day.
And he gives an Africanity to the interpretation of Jesus. He provided a spiritual perspective that was empowering.
There were people encountering Thurman's work and being shaken at their core.
I would have to find out what was the word that the religion of Jesus had to say to the man with his back against the wall.
I encourage you to go see the whole documentary. I'll tell the rest of the story, don't worry about it. You can see it on yourself. So before we go further, what Thurman made me do was to think back to my own background with race and looking at the age of people in this group. A lot of us were in the 60s or the 70s. I graduated from high school in 74. And so I was there during the midst of integration in Jacksonville, Florida, again, close to where he was in his time, or much earlier time. And I would invite you just for a minute to think about your experience of race. I'll give you my example of a couple of things that come to mind. My dad was a landscaper, and my dad had crews of men that came from inner city Jacksonville. So the people that were Thurman's people lived in the shacks in downtown Jacksonville, would come and work for my dad. And I remember James and Albert. It was interesting looking back. We had his foreman was the only literate person on the crew, and so he was put in charge. And you would never call him this today, but back then he was called Little Joe because my dad's name was Joe. And so, but he was Joe Chambers. I remember that. But it's just an experience of that. And then my home church, I was very blessed to be in a church. I'm sorry, I forgot. I'm not at the microphone. I was blessed to be at a church that was very involved in the inner city of Jacksonville, Riverside Presbyterian. And they had a Brooklyn ministry. And they didn't just do ministry there. They would bring folks from the inner city to the church so that my youth group was integrated youth group. We had, I remember Dewey and Darrell. It wasn't a big integration, but it was an integration. And so we had some personal relationships. Now, to be honest with you, at the time, I thought everybody did that. It was what churches did. Nobody told me it was different. So that was a norm. But then as I look back on how that influenced me in a subtle way, but a church doing that, just doing the normal things. And I, as a minister now, I thought, I wonder what pushback they got in the 60s for doing that and bringing kids from inner city who were black into vacation Bible school. To their credit, if there was pushback, it never made it to the level of those of us who were participating in the program. So that was just a cover. And then we had, I don't know how many of y'all had maids, but we had maids. Pearlie Mae was the maid that came to our house. We would take her to the bus stop and she'd go back home in the inner city. And maybe you had a Pearlie Mae. And when my mom died, Pearlie Mae called me to offer condolences. So those kind of relationships existed, but it was still in that social strata. So that was my experience. And I wanted to start my presentation by saying, what would a white man want to do with a black African American? Why is that interesting? Well, I think it's all going back to the social time of my life and the personal time. So think about your context, and then let's lead to what Howard Thurman's experience was now, because his experience was quite different. Born in 1899, Daytona Beach. We're going to talk a lot about his grandmother, and we'll share some stories about his grandmother in just a moment. Daytona Beach was a time when they were building railroads, and when Florida was starting to grow. He says himself that the black and white community in Daytona Beach was just a universe apart. They had nothing to do with each other. Blacks were offered education up to 7th grade. It was expanded to 8th grade, close to the time when Thurman went on. The KKK was identifying itself as a Christian organization, and he says people would leave their church to participate in the lynchings. That's his memory of his social world. And he would look back and say white clergy and laity were either silent or tepid in the face of the injustices. So that's his life. His personal life, his father worked for the railroad, made a good living, but he died when he was 7 years old. His mother becomes the primary provider. The grandmother's a great influence. I think we would call Thurman an introvert today. There's a lot about him being alone. He spent time in the woods, at the beach. That oak tree was an oak tree in the backyard and that he spent time with. And I wanted to share a quote about his time in the woods. Let me see if I can find that. To let you know, this was just how he experienced God in that part of his life. This is what he says about the woods. He says, "The woods befriended me. In long summer days, most of my time was divided between fishing in the Halifax River and exploring the woods, where I picked huckleberries and gathered orange blossoms from abandoned orange groves. The quiet, even the danger of the woods, provided my rather lonely spirit with a sense of belonging that did not depend on human relationships. I was usually with a group of boys. We explored the woods, but I tended to wander away to be alone for a time." He says, "Nightfall was meaningful to my childhood, for the night was more than a companion. It was a presence, an articulate climate. There was something about the night that seemed to cover my spirit like a gentle blanket. The night had its own language. Sometimes the night seemed to have movement in it, as if it were a great ocean wave. Other times it was deathly still, no rhythm, no movement. At such times I could hear the night think and feel the night feel. This comforted me, and I found myself wishing that the night would hurry and come, for under its cover my mind would roam. When things went badly during the day, I would sort them out in the dark as I lay in my bed, cradled by the night sky." So I hope that just gives you a sense of why nature was really important to him in his spiritual journey. In 1927, he married a woman named Katie Kelly. They had one child. She dies of tuberculosis. In 1930, she was a social worker, and they think she contracted it in her social work. So he has a 3-year-old, and he would take that 3-year-old and go on to teaching, and that would be a part of his journey. But just a few years later, he met a woman named Sue Bailey, who was at Spelman College, and she on her own was a force to be reckoned with. That's another person. I want to follow that track a little bit more later. But he described her as intellectual, a spiritual, and an activist. So just to get a little bit of a timeline, because I got confused as he went back and forth here and there. So this is kind of the timeline of his life. He starts in Daytona Beach. We'll talk about the Florida Baptist Academy in Jacksonville in a minute. He goes to Morehouse College. He's educated at Rochester. Goes to Haverford College. Rufus Jones is a Quaker teacher that becomes a great influence on him. He goes back to Morehouse to teach. He goes to Howard University. He becomes the dean of the chapel. He teaches. He begins an experiment that he would use in several churches with theater, dance, silence, and music. So we think liturgical dance and all that is something we in the 70s and 80s created. He was doing that back in the 40s. He was doing all this creative work in worship renewal. The famous visit to India and Gandhi we'll talk about. He was invited by a Presbyterian minister to co-pastor a multi-racial, multi-faith church in San Francisco. It still exists to this day. If you Google the Fellowship Church of All People, it's still there. And in 1949, writes a key book, Jesus and Disinherited, and then goes back to Boston University to become the first black dean of a white university at Marsh Chapel. And that's where he meets King doing his doctoral work at that time. And he served there till 65, but actually he was also friends with King's father, Martin Luther King Sr. They were more contemporaries in the journey. So I'm going to just mainly talk about who were his key influences going that next level. And the grandmother, the guy I call the man at the railroad station. And by the way, the stories I'll share with you are stories he repeats in his biography and his lectures. So we all have key stories in our lives that form us. I think these were the key stories that formed him. A guy named Mordecai Johnson, Rufus Jones, Gandhi, and then Dr. Albert Fisk. So we'll just take a little deeper dive, and I'm going to tell you some stories about them. First, his grandmother, Nancy Ambrose. This is a woman to be reckoned with. She was a steel magnolia if I've ever heard one. You'll know why when I tell you some stories. She was born into slavery and was in slavery until she was 20 years old. She instilled in her grandson the belief that all people were children of God. She was illiterate, so he would read the Bible to her. She said, I don't want to hear any of Paul, though. I don't read Paul to me because of slavery and by the misuse of slave owners. And there's a key story by the grandmother is the Negro minister preaching to slaves. So let me share a couple of stories that will tell you. My hunch is you've met people like her in your own life. You may be one of these people. I don't know. He said, and this is from his autobiography, and forgive me for reading, but I want you to hear his words of the story. He says, my young mother was a devout, dedicated, praying Christian. My father was a good man. And by the way, this is a story of the effect of his father's death on him and a traumatic part of the death. But you'll see the mother and grandmother woven into this. He says, my father was a good man, but the church was not for him. Even now I remember him sitting on the front porch, his legs crossed, looking into the distance, often with a book in his hand that I could not read or understand. In the final moment before he died, my mother said softly and with utter tenderness, Saul, are you ready to die? Between the great gasps for air, he managed to say, yes, Alice. All of my life I've been a man. I'm not afraid of death. I can meet it. And Thurman says, when a sudden death visited our house, I was sent to our neighbors to ask them to help us by giving whatever they could. I was not self-conscious. There was no embarrassment. This was a way of life in the neighborhood. In sorrows, joys, good times, and bad, this was the way we lived. We'd helped each other, and we survived. The burial and funeral arrangements were a serious problem. For in the eyes of the church, he was a sinner. In the language of the time, he died out of Christ. Have any of y'all ever heard that language? Yes, I see some of you said yes. Our pastor, therefore, refused to permit him to be buried from the church and was unwilling to take the ceremony himself. But to have it otherwise was unthinkable, hurtful, and so also impractical, because there was no funeral parlors and our homes were all too small to accommodate a group of any size. What were we to do? My grandmother, who took charge of the situation, did so in her customary manner. She went to the chairman of the board of deacons. All right, we all know this story, don't we? You cannot make the minister take Saul's funeral, but he has no right to keep him from being buried from the church. We hold the deacons responsible for this decision. Ministers come and ministers go, but the deacons stay here with us. Of course, he read her meaning quite clearly. At length, he agreed that my father should be buried from the church. Our next hurdle was to find someone to preach the funeral. By chance, if there is such a thing, there was a traveling evangelist in town, a man named Sam Cromart. I shall never forget him. He offered to preach Papa's funeral. He did not need to be persuaded. We sat on the front pew, the mourner's bench. I listened with wonderment, then anger, and finally mounting rage as Sam Cromartie preached my father into hell. This was his chance to illustrate what would happen to sinners who died out of Christ, as my father had done, and he did not waste it. Under my breath, I kept whispering to Mama, he didn't know Papa, did he? Did he? Out of her own pain, conflict, and compassionate love, she reached over and gripped my bare knees with her hand, giving a gentle but firm, comforting squeeze. It was sufficient to restrain for the moment my bewildered and outraged spirit. In the buggy coming home from the cemetery, I sought some explanation. Why would Reverend Cromart do this to Papa? Why would he say such things? Neither Mama nor Grandmother would answer my persistent query. Finally, almost to myself, I said, one thing is sure. When I grow up and become a man, I will never have anything to do with the church. He said, I remembered those words years later, driving home in the darkening shadows of that day in Roanoke when a man had died, his hand in mine taking with him my urgent prayers for the peace of his soul. I remember, too, over the road which I had come and followed my spirit back to the beloved woods of my childhood. When I was young, I found more companionship in nature than I did among people. And now, telling story. Oh, I got to tell you another story about the grandmother. Joining the church. This is another great one. I was 12 years old when I joined the church. It was the custom to present oneself to the deacons, which I did. They examined me, and I answered their questions. When they had finished, the chairman asked, Howard, why do you come before us? I said, I want to be a Christian. Then the chairman said, but you must come before us after you've been converted and have already become a Christian. Come back when you can tell us of your conversion. I went straight home and told my grandmother that the deacons had refused to take me into the church. She took me by the hand. I can still see her rocking alongside me. And together we went back to that meeting, arriving before they adjourned. Addressing Moses Wright, who was the chairman, she said, how dare you turn this boy down? He is a Christian and was one long before he came to you today. Maybe you do not understand his words, but shame on you if you do not know his heart. Now you take this boy into the church right now before you close this meeting. And they did. And he was baptized in the Halifax River, and he says, had that procession, in my mind is, oh brother, where art thou, procession, and they sang, and they had an old lady, right, who sang to us into the river, and the glorious voice she began, oh mourner, don't you want to go? Oh mourner, don't you want to go? Oh mourner, don't you want to go? Let's go down to the Jordan. Let's go down to the Jordan. Hallelujah. And he says, verse after verse, she sang all the way. Can you see that story? So anyway, that's a little bit about the grandmother. I think that's all the stories I have. Yeah, that's the main ones. But wasn't she a force to be reckoned with? So this next story really touched me, and I'll tell you why it touched me. And I call it the train station story. So as I mentioned earlier, public education only went to 8th grade in his time. And so he went to 7th grade, actually, and then he met with the superintendent and passed 8th grade. But there's nowhere to go. Well, he had a cousin in Jacksonville and said, well, you can come to Jacksonville and study at one of 3. There were only 3 schools in the state of Florida that would take black kids for high school at the time. So Jacksonville had one of 3. And he said a cousin who lived in Jacksonville told my mother if I enrolled in the academy, it was the Florida Baptist Academy, I could live with him and his wife doing chores around the house in exchange for a room, 1 meal a day. He says, when the time came to leave for Jacksonville, I packed a borrowed old trunk with no lock, no handles, roped it securely, and said my goodbyes and left for the railway station. When I bought my ticket, the agent refused to check my trunk on my ticket because the regulation stipulated that the check must be attached to the trunk handle, not to a rope. The trunk would have to be sent express, but I had no money except for $1 and a few cents left after I bought my ticket. And he tells this story again in one of his podcasts, and it was $3. He had $1.25 and did not have $1.75. And so he's sitting there, and this is what happened. He says, I sat down on the steps of the railway station and cried my heart out. Presently I opened my eyes and saw before me a large pair of work shoes. The eyes crawled upward till I saw the man's face. He was a black man dressed in overalls and a denim cap. And he looked down on me and he rolled a cigarette and lit it. Then he said, "Boy, what in the hell are you crying about?" And I told him. He said, "If you're trying to get out of this damn town to get an education, the least I can do is to help you. Come with me." He took me around to the agent and asked, "How much does it take to send this boy's trunk to Jacksonville?" Then he took out his rawhide money bag and counted the money out. When the agent handed him the receipt, he handed it to me. Then without a word, he turned and disappeared down the railroad track. I never saw him again. It made me think about, I wonder, and you may not even be aware, that man probably never knew that $1.75, that simple act, what would Howard Thurman be had not been for that? And who knows what little act of kindness you think is small could be life-changing, world-changing. And I just thought that's a good example of we may minimize something important. And when he talks about the story, he also talks about he really remembered the man never looked back. He never looked to see if he got on the train. He never looked for credit. He just gave it and he moved on. And he saw that as an example of Christian humility. So that's the man at the railroad station. That's the railroad station, Daytona Beach. So other influences, a guy named Mordecai Johnson. And I wanted to lift up the fact that he met him at a YMCA conference at Kings Mountain, North Carolina. So that's kind of interesting. He was a pastor, and he inspired him to go into ministry. Now, we've come a long way from this guy that would never go to church, right, and to going into ministry. And Thurman writes to ask him to become a guide and a counselor to him, which he would do for the rest of his life. He said, Johnson's advice focused on the importance of staying connected to his community, serving the needs of the marginalized, and applying his education to serve the people. And then later, Mordecai Johnson would become president of Howard University and hire him. So he was one, if you have lifelong mentors like I do, he was one of those lifelong mentors in his life. I think a really interesting story is Rufus Jones, a Quaker minister. And Thurman says he was just walking out of the library one day, and I forget which by the way, I think it was Morehouse. They said he read every book in the library at Morehouse. It may have been Howard, but every book in the library. But anyway, he found, I think of Union Seminary. For those of y'all remember those cheap books. I have in my mind Howard Thurman passing by the cheap book pile and picking up this book, Finding the Trail of Life by Rufus Jones. And he was captivated by it. He was at Haverford as a professor of philosophy. And so Jones guided his first extensive formal study of mysticism. And Thurman described his time with Jones as a watershed from which flowed much of the thought and endeavor to which I was to commit the rest of my working life. A good Quaker influencing him. And he actually studied for a summer at Haverford with Rufus Jones. Then most people know that he visited Gandhi, and he actually had a 100-day visit. It came under the guise of the YMCA and was with a group of other people. Excuse me, I'm trying to find my notes on this. I have my notes mixed up a little bit. There we go. So one thing, imagine I'm again trying, this boy from Daytona Beach, Florida, is now in India with the YMCA. And he gets exposed to Hindus and Muslims and many other religions and all the sorts of things going on there. There's a question I'll talk to you about of a lawyer, why would a black man be a Christian? And then he learned some things from Gandhi about their experience with the Hindus in India. And he had one request of the group, will you sing me this song? So let me share with you, again, a story about this trip. He says, and this was 1935, and he was asked how he could represent Christianity to the people of Sri Lanka and India after his forebears had been enslaved by Christians in America. Even after having been liberated from slavery, had been brutalized, lynched, and denied civil rights by those who claimed to be Christians. And then his answer gave us a sense of his approach to the Bible, to Jesus, Christianity, religion, and the evils of society. He says, it's far from my purpose to symbolize anyone or anything. I think the religion of Jesus in its true genius offers me a promising way to work through the conflicts of a disordered world. I make a careful distinction between Christianity and the religion of Jesus. My judgment about slavery and racial prejudice relative to Christianity is far more devastating than yours could ever be. From my investigation and study, the religion of Jesus projected a creative solution to the pressing problems of survival for the minority of which he was a part in the Greco-Roman world. When Christianity became an imperial and world religion, it marched under banners other than that of the teacher and prophet of Galilee. Finally, the minority in my country that is concerned about and dedicated to experiencing that spirit that was in Jesus Christ is on the side of freedom, liberty, and justice for all people, black, white, yellow, saint, sinner, rich or poor. And then he's talking to Gandhi about the lack of vitality actually among the Hindus in India. And he talks about the reasons for the lack of vitality. And this is one I think that really stuck with him, that, again, to be an underlying core of the message. The second reason for the lack of vitality, this is Gandhi, was the loss of self-respect. Thurman says, when he said that, I smiled smugly as if I knew a secret. Gandhi said, I see you're smiling. I said, yes, but it's not what you think. I'll tell you, Gandhi said, you are thinking that we have lost our self-respect because of the presence of the conqueror in our midst. That's not the reason. We have lost our self-respect because of the presence of untouchability in Hinduism. And then he gave us some rather strange, startling statistics about untouchables. Their large percentage in the population, their completely subordinated position as far as the rest of India was concerned. They are scavengers, the worthless. If the shadow of an untouchable falls on the Hindu temple, or in some instances on the street in which the temple is located, the temple is considered to be contaminated. I said, how on earth did you attack such a thing as that? He was striking close to home with this. Gandhi said, the first thing I did as a caste Hindu was to adopt into my family an outcast and make that person a member of my family legally and in all the other ways. This announced to the other caste Hindus, this is what I mean by what I'm saying. Then I changed the name from outcast to Harijan, a word that means child of God. His theory was that if he could make every caste Hindu, whenever he referred to an outcast, call him child of God, in that act he would create within himself an acute moral congestion that would not be resolved until his attitude was transformed. And then he said in this meeting, before he left, he asked, will you do me a favor? Will you sing me one of your songs for me? Will you sing, were you there when they crucified my Lord? He continued, I feel this song gets at the root of the experience of the entire human race under the spread of the healing wings of suffering. He says, my wife is a musician, but the rest of us will join her. So that was, and you can hear in that Hindu experience how that translates into this child of God language that will be important. And a couple of Presbyterian influences. So after this experience, again, you can see the expansion. I did get my notes a little backwards, so let me get back to this. So Albert Fisk was a Presbyterian clergyman and professor of philosophy in San Francisco. And this was a time in 1944, Japanese internment. People were flooding into the San Francisco area with different races and different issues going forward. And there began to emerge in San Francisco, how do we build bridges among all these groups? And he talks about Albert Fisk. He said he wrote me almost daily with anguish and distress. And it was his conviction that he wanted Thurman to come and help start this church. So he comes over and he says, who were the individuals who brought their personal dreams to be implemented by their commitment? And the people that formed this church were third and fourth generation Californians. A larger group came from the United States to work in defense industries. Many were in military service en route to or returning from Asia and South Pacific war zones. There was a Sekai group who took their name from the Japanese home where they lived, the owners having been sent to the relocation camp. And what their vision was is how do we develop this kind of multi-faith, interfaith work? That was the vision of Fisk. And he says, but none were more intriguing than Alfred Fisk. He was a doctor of philosophy from an Ivy League university, voting socialist, confirmed pacifist, ordained Presbyterian clergyman, devoted follower of Jesus Christ, social activist, and the Great War was a catalyst that precipitated his emergence at the leadership role. His wife Eleanor was also interesting. Born of educator missionary parents in China, she had an amazing gift of grace. So Fisk served the congregation for 2 years, as part-time as it was established, while maintaining his teaching. And he says in this congregation there were humanists and others with the widest range of political concerns and orientations. The one thing we had in common was a vast hunger for a better way of living together than we had ever known, and a deep spiritual hunger that only the God of life could satisfy. So they established this as the basis of membership. This is what you had to agree to join this church. I affirm my need for growing understanding of all men as sons of God, and I seek a vital experience of God as revealed in Jesus of Nazareth and other great religious spirits whose fellowship with God was the foundation of their fellowship with man. I desire to share in the spiritual growth and ethical awareness of men and women of varied national, cultural, racial, creedal heritage, united in religious fellowship. I desire the strength of corporate worship through the membership of the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples, with the imperative of personal dedication to working out God's purpose here and in all places. And once they had the official roster, they actually discontinued their organic relationship with the Presbyterian Church because they wanted not to be confined to a denomination, but to be open in a broad way. So they opened it up to anybody and everybody who wanted to join this fellowship. And he said, here at last I could put to test once more the major concern of my life. Is the worship of God the central and most significant act of the human spirit? Is it really true in the presence of God there is neither male nor female, child nor adult, rich nor poor, nor any classification by which mankind defines himself in categories, however meaningful? Is it only the religious experience that the individual discovers what ultimately he amounts to? So you can see again this kind of expansion that goes on. And just as an aside, I didn't mention it, but he did attend Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church one summer when he was studying at Columbia, and he was very taken aback by Dr. Hugh Black in that church, and he talked about all the pomp and the coattails and all that he experienced there. And he has this little story. He said that he went there, he says, the pews had little nameplates on them. I had no idea what they meant. So when I arrived that first Sunday, I took a seat on the pew, 2 from the front. Presently, an usher came down to speak to me. Since I was seated in a family pew, he assumed I was a servant of the family. I explained who I was and why I was there. He seemed pleased that I wanted to hear the famous preacher and assured me that because the family was away for the summer, it would be all right for me to sit in that pew each Sunday. And he said, the mind of Hugh Black roamed over the vast areas of biblical thought and gave listeners glad and dramatic tidings from the heart and spirit. All this and his delightful Scottish brogue. I just love things. Next time I go to Fifth Avenue, I'll just think of him sitting there. It's a great thing. But, I just love that Presbyterian influence. So the key work is this work that you heard the civil rights leaders said they carried with them, and I'm just going to give you the outline. This is kind of the summary of the whole work that you'll find. You must abandon your fear of each other and fear only God. You must not indulge any deception and dishonesty, even to save your lives. Your words must be yea, nay, anything else is evil. Hatred is destructive to hated and hater alike. Love your enemy, that you may be children of your Father who is in heaven. You can hear that underneath Martin Luther King, can't you? In the spirit of that. So a brief outline, it goes much deeper in the book, but he starts out with Jesus' identity and the relevance to the oppressed. He just points out that Jesus was poor, Jew under Roman occupation, making his life and teachings deeply relevant to the marginalized and disinherited. He said mainstream Christianity often overlooks this context, presenting Jesus as a figure for the powerful rather than the oppressed. And he reinterprets Jesus' message as a technique of survival for those with their backs against the wall, offering dignity and empowerment. And he talked about fear as a tool of oppression, as a pervasive force among the disinherited, stemming from systemic violence and social control. It erodes self-worth and is passed down generationally, creating a cycle of anxiety and helplessness. Thurman proposes that faith in God and the belief that all are children of God can counteract fear and restore inner strength. And he talks about deception, and what's interesting, the oppressed often resort to deception to navigate hostile environments, using it as a shield against exploitation. And he mentioned some biblical stories. If you think about it, there's some biblical stories of deception. And one story he points out is the one I would point out a different one, but he talks about when they were in captivity in Babylon, Ezekiel could not give words of comfort and guidance by direct and overt statement. If he had, he would have not lasted very long. The result would have been a great loss to the people and a tightening of the bonds that held them. He would have been executed. So he executed the form of deception. He put the words in the mouth of old king of Tyre that did not come from him at all, but from Nebuchadnezzar. It was Nebuchadnezzar who had said, I am a god. He used what we would call the double talk. But the Jews understood even though the Babylonian secret service was helpless because he was not openly talking against the state. And my hunch is we could have a Bible study on deception. But having said that, it says, while sometimes necessary, he warns that deception corrodes the soul. Sincerity is more aligned with the divine will and long-term justice. It's a very interesting chapter. And talks about hate as a destructive power. He says it's a natural response to impression, but ultimately dehumanizes both the hater and the hated. He emphasizes that hate cannot be the foundation of liberation as it perpetuates cycles of violence and decision. And I can't help but say, my mind goes to Israel and Palestine right now as I just say those words, and probably could go to other places. And the other part of the book is about love as a central ethic. The book culminates in a call to radical love, not as passive acceptance, but as transformative force. He sees love as the ethical core of Jesus' teachings, capable of breaking down barriers and restoring humanity. So that's the book, and I forgot to share a story, but maybe it was good. I will share the story at the end. Let me find it. It's the story I promised about the slave minister. Maybe this is a good story to end on. And then we're going to listen to this wonderful hymn that I think represents, it wasn't his hymn, but I think he would say, this represents who I am, the come and find the quiet center. And I'll invite you to a time of meditation as we listen to that. But anyway, let me read, this is from his autobiography. He says, once or twice, he said, looking back, it's clear to me that the watchful attention of my sponsors in the church served to enhance my consciousness that whatever I did in my life mattered. They added to the security given to me by the quiet insistence of my mother, and especially my grandmother, that their children's lives were a precious gift. Often Grandma would sense this awareness beginning to flag in us. When this happened, even when we were not aware of it, she would gather us around and tell us a story that came from her life as a slave. Once or twice a year, the slave master would permit a slave preacher from a neighboring plantation to come over and preach to his slaves. The slave preacher followed a long tradition, which has hovered over the style of certain black preachers even to the present time. It is to bring the sermon to a grand climax by the dramatization of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. At such times, one would wait for the moment when the preacher would come to this grand creative exposition. Sometimes he would begin in Gethsemane, with sweat like drops of blood running down, or with Jesus hanging on the cross. But always there was the telling of a timeless story of his last 7 words, the mother at the foot of the cross, the darkening sun, the astonishment of the soldiers, all etched in the stark language of stark reality. At the end he would be exhausted, but his congregation would be uplifted and sustained with courage to withstand the difficulties of the week to come. When the slave preacher told the Calvary narrative to my grandmother and the other slaves, it had the same effect on them as it would later have on their descendants. But this preacher, when he finished, would pause, his eyes scrutinizing every face in the congregation. And then he would tell them, you are not, and he'd use the N-word, you are not slaves. You are God's children. When my grandmother got to that part of her story, there would be a slight stiffening in her spine as we sucked our breath in our breath. When she had finished, our spirits were restored. What a grandmother. Yeah. What a grandmother. So I did want to close. When I was researching Thurman and thinking about his mysticism, and thought, this hymn, I love this hymn. I wish I could find, I wanted to have one with the words on it so you could also reflect on the words. So it's maybe not the most beautiful presentation, but I wanted you to hear the words. So I want to close with this as a meditation, then I remember to close with prayer. Thank you. I'll do that. And thank you for being here, by the way. I appreciate y'all. And
can we sing along if we know?
You're welcome to. life we lead. Find the room for hope to enter. Find the frame where we are freed. And the chaos and the clutter, clear our eyes that we can see all the things that really matter. Be at peace and simply be. Silence is the friend who claims us, cools the heat and slows the pace. God it is who speaks and names us, knows our being face to face, making space within our thinking, lifting shades to show the sun, raising courage when we're shrinking, finding scope for faith begun. Spirit, let us travel, open to each other's pain. Let our loves and fears unravel, celebrate the space we gain. There's a place for deepest dreaming, there's a time for heart to care. In the Spirit's lively scheming, there is always room to spare. Let us pray. God, we thank you for this place where we are right now, this place of Montreat, where there's plenty of space for quiet centers and silence and to enjoy the creation you've given us. Surely Thurman would have loved this place and walked around Lake Susan and heard you speak through the wonderful gift of this place. We're thankful for the saints of the church, all the saints, including Thurman, who's continued to speak to us from the generations. He is certainly in the cloud of witnesses that seeks to encourage us on our race. And we pray that we may hear your voice speak through him and through many others, and that he may help us navigate our time and keep us centered in you. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you, Jody Welker.